please protect us and be with us. And I pray for protection over Daniel, who's going to be traveling tomorrow. Please be with him. Be with us and give me clarity of speech as I struggle through this lesson. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, let's start with the Old Testament. We kind of laid the groundwork last time. And tonight we're going to talk about the canonization of the Old Testament. Canonization, that's a big word, and you see that at the top of your notes. First, I need to define the word canon. It is not a big thing that shoots stuff. It is a word that means, and that's given for you at the top, a collection or list of books accepted as authoritative, rule of faith, and practice. And the word canon derives from a Hebrew word, kana, which is actually a reed, like a little stalk of a plant. And people would often take these stalks, they would be growing straight. I think you could use them to whip people with them. But then you can also use to measure things with it, like a ruler. We call it in construction a story pole, I think is the proper term, the story pole, where you can kind of put it down and then you can make a measurement, pull a line, and so on and so forth. So we have a canon of Old Testament books. How did we arrive at our canon is a question we want to answer for the Old Testament. First of all, writing materials we didn't always have that, okay? I mean, humans had to invent writing materials. We had to come up with paper or write on things like rocks or stones, silver, gold, wax. Even sometimes people would write on wax. I know I'm getting a little away from the notes here, but like, think about Paul writing a letter. It is possible that Paul may have written some of his things down or had someone write them down on wax first, and you could kind of press it into the wax, and then they don't like that. You could actually erase it and redo it. You could heat it up or whatever. So there are wax tablets. So the first way of transmission of God's word was actually oral tradition, oral transmission. So Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9 says, Moses commanded the people of Israel to teach their children God's laws and statutes and to make them known to their sons and their grandsons. And so that's a passing on of something. Now, they did have written things during the days of Moses. And Moses is the author, first 5 books of the Bible. He probably did use source material for writing the first 5 books of the Bible. Yes, he received revelation from God, but I think he also had things to work with, things that were passed down orally, and possibly written things. Writing, some of the oldest writings that we have in terms of written works were found in Egypt, actually. Egypt is a place where they developed a sense, you remember hieroglyphics and pictographs. They would write, and they wouldn't always write with letters and then put the letters together and it made a word. Sometimes they would draw pictures, and that picture would mean something, pictographs. So we see that very, very old in Egypt. We see it in Assyria. Have y'all ever heard of cuneiform? That's one of the oldest kinds of writings that we know of to date. But we have stone tablets, obviously. In the Old Testament, Moses received revelation from God, written by the finger of God on stone tablets. And let me give you a quote here. I have that on the third heading there, stone tablets and other writings. Stone tablets upon which the Lord inscribed the 10 Commandments were stored where? In the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred place. The law of Moses was taught to the priests and commanded to be publicly read aloud every 7 years so that the Israelites would not forget God's laws. So here we see a combination of writing and oral memorization, or oral recitation and mental memorization. They were big on oral tradition, passing it down orally, but they were probably much better at memorizing things than you and I might be able to do. They depended on it. When we continue, it was to be stored alongside the Ark of the Covenant. Nothing was to be added to or deleted from the words. Again, it continues alongside this were the words of Joshua, the leader of Israel. We don't know where his book was stored, but we do know it was elevated in importance and authority. Again, 1 Samuel 10:25 records that Samuel did what? He wrote down the ordinances of the kingdom in a book and placed it before the Lord, presumably in the sanctuary. So in the Old Testament, we have evidence that they are writing. That they are writing things down, writing them in a book, putting them in the ark, and keeping them. Okay? Now, the first reference we have in the Bible to a completed work of, quote, the Scriptures is found in Daniel. Let me read for the first reference to collection of biblical materials in Daniel 9, verse 2, where it says, in the first year of his reign, Darius, I, Daniel, understood, and here's the phrase, I have it bolded and underlined for you, from the Scriptures. So from the writings. So there's this idea that by the time of Daniel, there was some type of collection already. Some type of collection of writings that they had and had kept in Israel by his time. And they revered it. They saw it as authoritative. According to the word of the Lord Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. So he's already reading, Daniel is reading Jeremiah in his day. So they're recognizing his as authoritative. I think actually it was Jeremiah that was the one that had his scroll burned, and then the Lord said, rewrite it. So the idea of writing in the Old Testament and keeping the books was extremely important. Now I've given you a list of references also. Kind of in the middle of the page it says other references include 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and this should say Nehemiah, not new. That was an autocorrect that I didn't catch. So there are other references of where in the Old Testament you're seeing where these authors are referring to the books. They're referring to the records. So there was this tradition in the Old Testament of where they wrote and kept the records. I want you to see that. Okay? So this isn't something that we developed during the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. That's way later, where there are these debates going on what books belong in the Old Testament, what books don't belong in the Old Testament and in the New. They already had a tradition in place where they are writing and preserving and keeping and recognizing authoritative works. So, when do Old Testament books stop being written? And this is right there on that first page there. Prophecies and writings ceased around 400 BC. There were no more books of the Bible being written after that time until you get to the New Testament. I've referred to this in my sermons, but this is called the 400 years of silence. Has anyone ever heard of the 400 years of silence? Yes. So it is the time period between Malachi and Matthew, if you can say it that way. Malachi and the New Testament. Why were there no prophets during that time? Why were there no writings? Because God said there would be no writings. In the book of Amos, if I can say it this way, God was fed up with them ignoring his word. And he said there's going to be a drought in the land. And it's not going to be a drought for water. It's going to be a drought for my word. And he understands that, or they understood that to be God's going to stop. He's already spoken to you immensely by the prophets, and he's going to stop because you're not listening. And then there was 400 years of silence, and there was nothing said by a prophet. Now, does that mean people weren't writing books? No. There were people writing books. There were people writing history books during the time of the 400 years of silence. And some Christian traditions bring those books into their Bible. The Roman Catholics do. The Roman Catholics have the books that were written from 400 BC up to the New Testament and past in their Bible, and it's called the Apocrypha. So, I want to answer the question, why? Why is the Apocrypha, the group of books that were written during that 400 years of silence, not in the Protestant Bible? One, this is number one at the bottom. Jewish tradition did not admit it, didn't allow it. In other words, the Jews did not recognize it as authoritative. That's a pretty big point. And I've given you a quote there from Rabbi Abdimi of Haifa, saying, since the day when the temple was destroyed, prophecy has been taken from the prophets and given to the wise. Second reason, this is an important reason too. You can read this with me. First Maccabees denies it. First Maccabees is a book that was written it's an apocryphal book. So it's a book that was written during that time period. And it says, do not search for a prophet. Okay? So it'd be like if I lived during that time period and I said in that time period, there's no prophets here, that would be pretty convincing. That would be pretty authoritative, right? Because I'm living in that time period. Maccabees is in that time period and says, don't look for a prophet because there's not one. So one of the books, at least, admits it. It says that there's no reason to. So, and I'll give you the quote here from 1 Maccabees 9, verse 27. It says, in the apocryphal book of 1 Maccabees, Simon Maccabeus speaks of the great sorrow in Israel, such as there had not been since the prophets ceased to appear to them. Okay? Third reason we don't accept the Apocrypha, and this is kind of a flexible point. I'll explain that in a minute. But the New Testament does not verify it. The New Testament doesn't verify it. It says, indeed, New Testament writers quote from almost every Old Testament book of the Protestant canon. Jesus seems clear about it, what constitutes the Old Testament canon, stating that in Luke it went from Genesis to Chronicles. This is maybe the most forceful argument. So, I'm going to I don't remember the reference. I'm very sorry about this. I should have looked this up. But Jesus was speaking, I believe it was to the Pharisees in the Gospel of Luke. And he said, the blood of the prophets is going to be on your hands. From the blood of Abel. Remember Abel? Abel was the son of? Who was Abel the son of? Adam. There we go. To the blood of Zechariah. Now, that's important because what Jesus is doing is Abel occurred in Genesis. And then Zechariah was one of the last prophets that was killed. And you find him at the end of 2 Chronicles. The reason why that's important is because he's recognizing Genesis to Chronicles. Now, if you remember from last week, I told you the Hebrews understood their Old Testament started with Genesis and ended with Chronicles. So that the Hebrew version of the Old Testament and the structure did not include those apocryphal books. Does that make sense? That's a pretty forceful argument. When Jesus says the blood of the martyrs is going to be on you from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, he's saying from beginning to end. Does that make sense? And the beginning of the Bible is Genesis. The end of the Old Covenant Bible then is Chronicles. Okay? Now, here's why this point is a little bit flexible. There are places in the New Testament where they allude to apocryphal writings or writings from the pseudepigrapha, false writings. Jude is an example. Hebrews is another example. Jesus celebrated a festival that started in the days of silence. Hanukkah. You all remember Hanukkah, right? There's evidence, very clear evidence that Jesus celebrated Hanukkah in John. So, that doesn't mean that the New Testament is saying, aha, the Apocrypha is verified. It's not quoting it. It's not saying, thus saith the Lord. It's not quoting it as authoritative. Jesus is giving a structure to the Old Testament that seems to agree with the Jewish understanding of the Old Testament. 4, why does the Catholic Church accept these books? Plain and simple, I think the answer is because of St. Augustine. I think that's the easiest. Because of St. Augustine. This is number 4 on the next page, top of the next page. Page number 2 at the top. The reason why the Roman Catholic Church accepted these books in their Bible is because Augustine told Jerome to do it, and he caved. That's, I think, the main reason. Okay. This debate wasn't settled until the Reformation. Okay. Well, there are evidences then of what the Old Testament was composed of within the Bible. What about outside the Bible? I am going to pass around this because I didn't have it last week. One of the big evidences is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint or the Septuaginta, which means the 70. And this is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. I'll pass this around. You guys can look at it. Now, I will say this isn't settled evidence because guess what? The Apocrypha is in that book too. It is included. But we do have the Old Testament books in this early translation. Philo of Alexandria, though Philo quotes all the books of the Pentateuch, most of the books of the prophets, and several of the books of the Hagiographa, often with the formulas recognizing their divine authority, he never once quotes from the book from the Apocrypha. And I have several other lists there. Second Esdras, Josephus, Melito, Bishop of Sardis. There's a list in Jerusalem. Origen, Athanasius, and Jerome, they all recognize the Jewish version without the Apocrypha. Okay, what then is the criteria for accepting something into the Old Testament as canon? And I have 4 criteria for you. I think this is helpful. 1, it cannot contain contradictions. They're looking at a book and they're saying, this seems to be biblical. If it's internal contradictions, if it's contradictions with other accepted books, it's not accepted. In the Apocrypha, there are some weird things. So baptisms, I think, on behalf of the dead is kind of an interesting thing. We're actually going to deal with that in 1 Corinthians at one point. But the Catholic Church used the Apocrypha to justify the sale of indulgences. Isn't that convenient, by the way? I've got a book in the Apocrypha to help me sell more indulgences. There are also other contradictions, historical contradictions, things that don't add up. They don't seem to agree. So 2, it had to be written by a prophet or someone recognized as having authority. Moses, Joshua, Samuel, Amos, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and so forth. Written by a prophet or someone closely related to the prophet. They had to have authority. Let me pause and say something about criteria number 2. It is true we don't know who the authors are of every book of the Old Testament. We don't know. 1st and 2nd Kings, Chronicles, we're not sure. There are scholars that read into it and they look into it deeply, but I think the general consensus is big question mark. Okay? But let's move on to 3. What's another criteria? It originated through inspiration, had to be inspired, had to have that formula, thus saith the Lord, if you will. And then 4, and we actually rely heavily on number 4, believe it or not. You and I, as Christians, Gentile Christians, maybe some of you have Jewish heritage, you rely heavily on the tradition of the Jewish people, accepting what is authoritative. You do. We do. So last week we looked at this book right here, and this was the Hebrew Bible. Here's the front. Now, this looks like the front, but it's not. It's the back. This is the front. You start here, turn that way. Isn't that fun? That's tough. And nobody can read that. I'm just kidding. People say it's all Greek to me. I'm like, Greek's easy. You have no idea. This is where the rubber meets the road. So, we rely heavily on this, you might say, the Masoretic text of the Bible, the Jewish traditional exception of what they believe to be the books of the Bible. Okay? That's confirmed also by the New Testament. I didn't put that as part of the criteria, but I do think it might deserve to be there. When the New Testament quotes something from the Old Testament, or especially when Jesus quotes something from the Old Testament, and he's recognizing it as authoritative, then we should too. And so we do. Okay. Let's move on then to the next heading. So we've looked at the canon. We've looked at what the canon is, what qualifies something as being part of the Old Testament canon. Let's talk about its transmission. Now, this is important. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm going to go ahead and say this. We do not have a single original autograph of any book of the Bible. Not one. Even though this is very old, right? This is the Hebrew Bible, Masoretic text. It's young in terms of what it's representing. It's a translation. It's a transmitted, copied book. We don't have not one, original writing of any book of the Bible. We have copies. Is that a problem? No, it's not a problem. Why? I'll explain why we don't have a little bit later. But I'm going to tell you what we do have, these copies. We have very, very old copies. And I learned something today about this. I thought the earliest copies that we have were the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I was wrong about that. I didn't think it was. I thought that was it. I thought that was the oldest one. But it's not. So let's look at the original sources. I should say the oldest sources. First one, and this is the earliest one. Silver amulets. That sounds like something that you would hear out of a video game, doesn't it? I've got the silver amulet. What is the silver amulet? The Ketef Hinnom scrolls, which contains a fragment from Numbers 6 and Deuteronomy 7. These silver amulets are what they sound like. They're very small, and if you have your phones or anything, I would encourage you, you can take a look at it on Google. Look up silver amulets, look up the Ketef Hinnom scrolls. It is silver. It's literally on, like, I think 95 or 99% silver, engraved in the silver. It is the oldest copy of Bible verses, if I can say it that way, that we have to date. And look at the date. This is crazy. Mid-7th century BC. That is crazy. I just want to say that is very, very early. Mid-7th century BC. Way back. Now, I think part of the scroll contains the high priestly blessing. So I've tried to do this. I actually messed up on it one time for the benediction. Do you remember when I was like, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and may he give you peace. Remember that? Okay, so that's part of the high priestly blessing, and I screwed up one day for benediction. But I think that that's actually part of the Ketef Hinnom scrolls. That may be the oldest. You could say it this way. You could fact check me on this, because I was reading this and I was reading a lot of things. I can't remember everything perfectly, as you know. But if you want to say, well, what's the oldest copy we have of Scripture? It may be the high priestly blessing and a couple other things with it. It's not a complete copy of the Old Testament. No, that would be quite something, especially if it was on silver. We don't have it. We just have a fragment. So that's the earliest fragment we have. Then we have something that is number 2, listed there under original sources. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. I am not going to go into the history of the Samaritans. That would be fun. But the Samaritan people had a version of the Pentateuch themselves, written in their dialect. We do have this. It is very old. It is good. It's generally used for studying Pentateuch studies in depth. Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. So that's what they recognized as authoritative, the Samaritans. That's pretty much the only thing that they recognized as authoritative. So we have a very early version of it, which means if the Samaritans had a version of the Pentateuch, it means that there was an earlier version, right, that they were referencing to get theirs. Okay, so they had to get it from somewhere. They had to copy it from somewhere. How similar is the Samaritan Pentateuch with the Pentateuch in the Masoretic text? There's some similarities. There are some differences. Like the Ten Commandments in the Samaritan Pentateuch, they say, well, there should be a holy place built on Mount Gerizim. Well, that's not in the Hebrew text, but it is in the Samaritan text. So I think there's some 6,000 errors or differences. 2,000 of those 6,000 agree with the Septuagint. 4,000 don't. But a lot of them are minor, like grammatical things or little vowel points and so on and so forth. So, then, number 3, what's another source that we have for the Old Testament? It says DSS. Any guesses? What does DSS stand for? I've already mentioned it.
Dead Sea Scrolls.
Dead Sea Scrolls, there we go. Dead Sea Scrolls. Very likely one of the most important discoveries in the 1940s in terms of not just biblical archaeology, but all archaeology. Every single Old Testament book and books from the Apocrypha were found in the caves at Qumran, at the Dead Sea. Except one. Maybe 2. Does anyone know what book was not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls? It's the one that the Old Testament, they're divided on most. They don't know. Some scholars are like, I don't know if this book should be in the Old Testament. Does anyone know what that book is? Esther. Esther. It's not found in the Dead Sea Scroll copies. And maybe Nehemiah is not there either. Okay? There's fragments. When you think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, don't think that there were a bunch of pots and they were filled with sand and there were scrolls. Don't think that there's just a complete scrolls in every single piece of pottery. No, there's not. There's fragments. There's pieces. They have to piece them together. Don't think, oh, it's perfect. They're written in gold letters and perfectly preserved lambskin. No, that's not the case. They have to do really hard work of piecing these things back together. But I do think one of the most clear copies of the books that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Isaiah scroll. It's the Isaiah scroll. It was kept in remarkably good tact, okay? And eventually we'll preach through that book. A few more, and I'm going to try to pronounce these as best as I can. Just a list of other manuscripts. The Nash Papyri, or the Nash Papyrus. You can look that up on your own. The Muhraba-at manuscripts. The manuscript of Masada. The manuscript at Nahal Heber. The Geniza fragments. All of these are fragments or pieces of papyri that they're studying to put together the Old Testament. But there was a family that devoted themselves to compiling Old Testament manuscripts and preserving them. And you may have heard of the Ben Asher family if you've done a little bit of research on this. If you haven't, that's fine. But with the Ben Asher family, we find a couple of codexes. And this says codes. It should say codex. That's, again, a typist error. But we have codexes. Codexes are like books. And they're a little bit later in terms of date, but they're very well preserved. Codex Kyrensis. We have the Aleppo Codex. That's very important for the Old Testament. The Oriental one. And the fourth one listed for you, that's a big one. I'm going to try the best I can to say this. Codex Leningradensis. This is one of the most important Old Testament codices that there is for studying the original versions of the Old Testament. Codex Leningradensis. And then we also have other books that we study to look and compile our Old Testament that were translations. I've already passed around one. Where is that, by the way? I passed around the Septuagint. There it is. Yeah, that's fine. I'll get it from you later. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Some say 250 BC. Again, I've mentioned that before. Next one is Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus. All of these are translations. And then in the early church, after the days of Jesus, there was a man who devoted himself on compiling different translations of the Bible next to each other. Have any of you guys ever been to Christian bookstore and you walk into like the back section where there's all the theology books that a lot of people don't go to. And you can find an interlinear Bible. Have y'all ever seen an interlinear Bible? What they have is they have English on one side and Greek on the other, or English on one side, Hebrew on the other. You've seen the interlinear Bibles. Some interlinear Bibles are really good. They have line for line. Okay, and so that's helpful. We have one like that. We have an interlinear Bible that goes all the way back to the days of the New Testament. And it was compiled by a guy named Origen. And he had six different translations next to each other. Six different versions. Let me read it for you. That's number 10, 5, and then you can see it under Origen there. It says he had the Hebrew text. Then he had the Greek transliteration. Not translation, but transliteration, where he's translating every single word literally. And then Aquila's Greek version, and then Symmachus's Greek version, and then revisions from the Septuagint, and then Theodosian's Greek version. So all of these were next to each other and next to the Hebrew text. And Origen was one of those scholars that really was interested in not leaving any stone unturned. And so he wanted to have it all there together. All right, let me pause and ask and offer some things, and I'll open it up for questions because I know I've said a lot. All of this stuff is available online. If you want to see any of these codexes, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, those are really cool to look at. I want to say that they're really things of beauty, I would say. Silver amulets, the Codex Leningradensis of the Old Testament. You can find them online. Libraries have professional-looking digital copies online. You can actually flip through them like you would a book. And I would say definitely go online and do that and see what it is we actually have. And you'll find that there's just thousands of different manuscripts, pictures, and translations and things in which we balance them against each other to find actually what the original sources say. Remember, we don't have any original autograph. I'll explain why pretty quickly. What we have are copies. So the question is, well, if we only have copies, how do you go about finding which copy is the best? Right? Which one's right? If we're trying to believe Bible, which one's right? So you don't go, I'll give you some, this is a whole science called textual criticism. And that was the hardest class I had in seminary next to PhD classes. Very difficult. But you don't simply go with which text had the most support. You can't do that. You can't say, well, most people in the room are saying this, therefore it's true. You can't do that with texts. You have to go with what is the oldest. You prefer something that's older than younger. So how far can we go back? What's the closest to the original? Where was it found? Geographically, where was it found? If it's speaking about something that happened in Israel and it was found in America, why was it in America, for one, you know? So like, for instance, I just took a jab again at Joseph Smith. It's hard not to, but apparently he reached into a rock and he found golden tablets with Egyptian hieroglyphics written on them in the United States, and he had a 3rd grade reading level, and he translated them perfectly. If anyone served you up something that was false, that would be it. I mean, that is as bakar. So, now I'm speaking in tongues. But, that's just bull, okay? But why in the world would Egyptian hieroglyphics be on golden tablets in the United States? And I asked a Mormon one time, I said, well, where are those golden tablets? Oh, the Lord came down from heaven and he grabbed them and took them back. I said, well, that's convenient.
They were lost.
That's convenient.
Joseph found them.
That's convenient.
God didn't know where they were.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that.
Yeah. I had a fun talk with a Mormon once for that, but that just doesn't make sense at all, historically, geographically, literarily, logically. So, we have to look at what's old. Where was it found? How old was it written? What carries the most weight? And then we have to look at the number of manuscripts we have and balance them out as best we can. The beauty of New Testament and Old Testament textual criticism is still going on today. It's still going on today. In fact, I think it's probably better today than it was before the Reformation. During the Reformation, right before the Reformation, there was a huge push to find original manuscripts. Huge push. And they wanted to find them. They wanted to read them in the original language. And so they began to compile so many different things from all over Eastern and Western Europe. And so it produced now what we have today is a huge library of Old Testament and New Testament manuscripts that we can study and study it in depth. There are people that study this stuff in depth. And I want you to know that the Bible that you have, this ESV Bible that we have in our pews, it's based off of the earliest and the best manuscripts that we have. But if Tony, for instance, he's got the King James Version of the Bible, he will have his version based on different manuscript evidence. Slight variations, not of a big deal at all, but it will have variations. If you go with the very, 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 very old King James Version, that's based on very few manuscripts, very few. So the newer translations that we have, even in English, I would say are extremely good. They're extremely reliable. Now, with the development of computer software and AI, a lot of scary things with AI. I will say, though, it does make text criticism easier. I've done it at a higher level, and I was so grateful to be able to search for something very quickly in a whole bunch of different ancient manuscripts and see it right there before my eyes. So, are there any questions real quick?
Computer model called the CBGM
Yes.
that compiles and evaluates all of those thousands.
What's that stand for?
Coherent-based something. I had to look it up. I was lucky to remember the acronym. That's the name. Coherent-based something methodology. It's a coherent-based genealogical methodology. So it looks at all of the manuscripts and evaluates which ones are linked to which one are the oldest. And I don't know what all determinations it makes, but it makes which one is likely to be the oldest. Which one has the most coherent or comparative to everything else. Which translation is most likely to be the right one. Which one appears to be a variant of the original translation and all that sort of stuff.
And that's on what website again?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know that it is on a website.
I thought there was a website that because you said that acronym, and I was like, yes, that's.
I think
What's
James
the
White
acronym?
discusses that.
CBGM.
Yeah, he's big on that.
Coherent-based genealogical methodology is what it's called.
There may be that .org.
There's all kinds of stuff on it. When Brad set that out, what you may know.
And they say they can do really good stuff.
Yes.
And what's exciting to me is they put all this stuff in a computer and they still can't dispute the Bible.
Right.
It looks like if
Right.
they're ever going to have a tool that can prove the Bible to be false, they've got it. And they just can't do it.
I know, it's amazing. It's great stuff. Right now there's a scholar that was at Southern, and he was the head of the Hexapla Institute. And he's trying to, along with a team of other people, compile for the first time ever a text critical edition of the Septuagint, which hasn't really been done. And it's happening like right now. So there's exciting things with that. Now those are some deep waters. Like I said, it was the hardest class.
They're guys that's their life. It's what they do.
And I'm grateful for that. I really am grateful for those people because they do a lot of work so that preachers can do their job well. Does that make sense? Like it's tough stuff. So, all right. I want to talk a little bit more about the development of the Hebrew text, and then we'll stop, okay? I've already mentioned, I'm on number 2 of that 3rd page. I've already mentioned that there's no autographs, original first-hand writings. Why? One of the reasons why is because of age and decay. Age and decay. Paper just doesn't last forever. Even our own paper, right? But especially an ancient man's paper, it would have likely have been written on papyrus, which have been beaten like little sticks together into a little bitty tight kind of methodology in a cross-hatch way, and you write on it. Eventually that wears out and it kind of becomes like dust. Okay? Breaks, gets torn. Leather fades, same thing, shrinks. People say, well, I need to use this for a napkin now. It could be anything. There were palimpsests that they would write, and this is much later, but they would write on one side, then they would write on the other, or they would cover one side, and they would rewrite something over the top of it. So we have versions on top of versions. Age and decay, this was a constant usage, would lead to deterioration of writing materials, and it would just make it very unlikely that any autograph would survive at all. The very fact that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls preserved in pots in sand was kind of a remarkable thing. It was a very big deal. 2, war. War and destruction. You can look at the history of Israel, tons of war. I mean, when they burned down temples, what do you think burned with it? Writings. Unless they made a conscious effort to get those writings out of there, which they would have. But I'll say this, number 3, reverence for the text. You say, well, how did that promote like not having a manuscript? Because when Hebrew and Jewish people were under attack, they might not want the pagans to touch their original texts, and so they would destroy them. They don't want them to be contaminated by the pagans. This is true, that they would do that. It's just like, oh man, that's really tough. But that was their reverence for the text. They thought, oh, I don't want the text to be touched by idol worshippers' hands. So I'm going to...
You mean touched in the sense of them contaminating it or them copying it and rewriting it?
Both. Like touched physically, or worse, which would be disseminating it with adding in materials, which would be worse. So that added some difficulty on the transmission of the Old and the New Testament. The New Testament was a little bit different. New Testament, you would have the authorities come and knock on your door, and they would say, where are the scrolls? And some Christians would hand the scrolls over, and the early church had to kind of debate with themselves, should we excommunicate these people because they just handed over scriptures? Or should we allow them to repent? You know, that was actually a thing that they had to deal with in the New Testament. So it was a little bit different than the New. All right. Old Testament then, prior to AD 100. I've given you this, and here are the dates. The Dead Sea Scrolls, even though they're old, they only date 250 BC to 50 AD. That's the time period. It's kind of a large gap. Silver amulets, mid-7th century BC, written in Paleo-Hebrew script. Paleo just means old. Early Hebrew. There's some problems with this. Look at. They wrote in what's called continuous script. So imagine no spaces, no punctuation, anything like that. I want you guys to read that number 1 there, that example. What does that say? It's written in English. Huh? God is now here, or God is nowhere. See how that can be difficult. If it's just written continuously with no gaps, no spaces, it's either God is now here or God is nowhere. Which translation works? That's just an example. That's a fun example. But that's what they had to deal with the early Hebrew script. Translation issues. Amos 6, verse 12 is an actual example of this. Listen to this. It says, do horses run on rocky crags? Answer is no. Does one plow with an oxen? Answer is yes. But you have turned justice into poison and the fruit of righteousness into bitterness. Now on the surface it's like, that doesn't make any sense. The first question you ask, the answer is clearly no. The second question you ask should also be what? No. But it's actually yes. But there's different ways to translate it to where those questions are answered in a different way. So it becomes difficult with the translation, with the transmission and translation issues. This should say the work of the scribes, not the word of the scribes. Scribes began to function from about 500 BC to 100 AD, and they were called the Sepharim. They arose to preserve Israel's sacred tradition. The Talmud says the early scholars were those of the Sepharim because they used to count all the letters in the Torah. That is true. They highly respected the Torah, and so what they would do is they would count every letter. And so if they got to a place where they were copying and they realized we are one number off for this letter, start over.
So it's like a checksum.
Do what?
You know what a checksum is, right?
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah, it's got to be perfect. It's got to be perfect. So, I mean, and then it got really systematic. The number of the letter, the number of the line, and everything. And they were very serious about it. It wouldn't be like, oh, well, we'll just redo this page. I mean, you start over. Can you imagine being hired to do something like that? And you get to the end and you realize that you're one off. It's like, oh. And I don't know if you remember, I want you to look at these letters really quickly, right here. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Those are the letters. A lot of them look similar to me. And can you imagine copying for 6 hours straight? I think all of them would look similar to me.
yeah, well, there's one error in King James that
there's
it's some
several
punctuation thing. That I guess we didn't discover it till
Are you talking about the
I think it's in one of the books of John.
well, there's one.
I think it's just like
The Trinity?
It's like a dot missing or something like that.
Oh, I thought you were referring to something else. Well, the King James, 1 John, has a whole, line or two.
Oh yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's many different
Yeah,
versions
that's
there.
supposedly the scribes thought it'd be better to include.
Right.
This that they weren't sure, but it'd be better to include it than leave it out. So.
Yeah. Yep.
Supposedly.
Some errors were actually on purpose, if I can say it that way. Okay, let's go to the last page. We'll go through this really quickly. For the Old Testament text, we have essentially what we use is the standardized text. That was, and this, I know this is later, but it's probably the best version we have, AD 100. There was a strong movement that established the Masoretes, 5 to 100. They devoted themselves to copying and copying and copying, and they added notations. They added points and vowels. They wanted you to understand it. Chapter and verse divisions. When do they come in? They are so late. I do wish, I like chapter and verse. It makes it easy to look something up, doesn't it? We have Bible drill that's literally based off of chapter and verse. Chapter and verse didn't come in until about 1200 AD. Stephen Langton. You didn't have any chapter and verse divisions until that late in the game. So that's super late. Most of the time when you're reading the Bible, you're memorizing it in terms of sections, in terms of inclusios, and you're looking for actually how it reads like you might say a book, not chapter and verse. I really, really, really don't like the versions of the Bible that have every verse with its own line. Like, we don't read that way. People don't write that way. And it's kind of like, it really divides it up, and I actually think it lends itself to not reading something in context. It helps people take verses out of context, actually. Okay. Collections of evidence. All right. The Masoretic text, number one. Scribes maintain the Hebrew text tradition from about the 1st century until modern times. It derives from the same tradition as the Masoretes. I have some typist errors there. It goes back much earlier. The Samaritan Pentateuch, you study it for the first 5 books of the Bible. Qumran manuscripts, that is the Dead Sea Scrolls, every Old Testament book except for Esther and Nehemiah. And I've mentioned a few others there. We have the Septuagint, Syriac Peshitta, Jewish Targums, and the Vulgate. What kind of errors do we find in these manuscripts? These are the accidental ones. I'm going to go through them with you at another time, though. Okay, I'm not going to get there. I listed them for you, but we'll go through them. We'll look at them next time, okay? All right, we'll pause here and ask if there's any questions. Next will be those errors, and then we'll talk about the New Testament.
You mentioned earlier,
Michael, can I turn this off?